Hi, this is Joanne Gannon, and this is my multimedia presentation, Module 1. And we're looking at the Chapter 5, Chapter 6, and Chapter 8, Education. I'm calling it Education for All, because education is power. Knowledge is power. And I'm looking at it not being a privilege, but a basic human right. Now, just as an overview on all three chapters, I've given them kind of a really brief theme. Chapter 5 was about opportunity and social justice schools, social class and inequality. Chapter 6, cultural difference and identity, I've given it acceptance and assimilation. And when we're looking at Chapter 8, which is gender, sex and sexuality, I'm looking at identity reimagined. And I've put connectedness in the middle of those circles because there is a connectedness with all of those three chapters. Now, the one I want to focus on the most is social class and inequality, Chapter 5. And if you look at this mind map, you can see that I've actually drawn out what the chapter is basically about. And it's conceptualizing social class. You can see the red line, and above the red line, you can see the social theorists, Marx, Weber, Bourdieu, Bernstein, and Delpit. And they're basically from the 1900s to the 1960s to the 2000s. So that's looking at the history. But the one I particularly want to look at is Marx. Class determined by labour and ownership, working class versus capitalist class. And Marx was a champion for the working class, and he actually wanted to overthrow the unjust capitalist system. So, and then below the line, you're looking at the challenging social class inequality. So you're looking at the education system in the 21st century, from meritocracy to the rule of the markets. And you're looking here, the chapter looks at funding, meritocracy, intersectionality, inclusiveness, social imagination, social mobility, social analysis. But I want to look at the idea of sociological imagination, which is educational practices aligning with wider social and historical contexts. And here is the other chapter around gender issues, which is, I'll just give some time to look at that. And when I look at the social imagining, we can also compare it in the issues around gender and what that says. We can also look at it around cultural difference and identity, and how it reflects the social imagination, how it reflects on cultures of Australian education, the migration, refugees in education, policies, programs, parameters, implications for education, particularly in Australia where it's actually a hot potato subject. But before I do that, I want to look at the hierarchy of school needs, as you can see on this graph, because, you know, at the end of the day, a student is a human being, and children need to have their basic school needs met before you can actually even look at any kind of social class. This little call-out box here, I've given it geographical, parents' education, parents' occupation, Indigenous, refugee, asylum seeker, settler, gender. And that little call out box will appear in some of the other slides for a particular reason. When we look at Chapter 5, we look at the social classes, and you can see them all written down here. And social class compared with educational inequality. There they are there. The Marxist theory is here. It's written out for you to see. So when you think of social and cultural capital, Marxism knew that schools can reproduce inequalities because the cultural capital doesn't convert into rewards later in life. And you can see by these dot points exactly what he was on about. But looking at the classes, I actually wanted to break it down and look at the kinds of employment, the kinds of workers that we have in those classes, and particularly the lowest grade workers, pensioners and other dependent on welfare state for their income, and then the upper middle class, which is the professional job employers. That's the status quo class systems. And again, we've got the call out box, which is looking at all those areas, and there's a reason why we're looking at them. So when we think of class systems, you can't go past the 4 dimensions of poverty. SIDA, which is a Swedish development group, has categorized them into these 4 dimensions. And alongside it, I've actually placed social class and inequality chapters, cultural difference and identity, and the gender and education for all. And you can see the call out box, which we will get to. And some of the researchers like Francis and Mills, you know, they really want to say constructive and focused on a new way of research, a new way of going forward. And that way is social justice schools, education for sustainability. And there's the definition there from the Government of South Australia. Social imagination, the educational practices align with wider social and historical context. So there's a definition down here in this box, what it is, personal troubles versus public issues, etc. So what we're looking at here is a response to the post-global financial crisis, which brought about the emergence of the socially just school teacher education response. When the global financial crisis hit, in America, hundreds if not thousands of teachers were sacked. The upper middle class became the middle class, and the poor became homeless. And here you can see the property development toolbox, and the Swedish development group looked at who they were, but around here you've got to see what they have: opportunities and choice, human security, resources, power and voice. And around here you've got the political institutions, the conflict, environmental context, economic and social context. So, and we've got the drop-down box, which we'll come to later. So a socially just school system can be a consequence of the global financial crisis, and it addresses these needs. So we need to be pursuing and reimagining education after the global financial crisis. And here we can see just some researchers and what they say about it. You can read it on the screen. Social reimagination also, you know, it speaks to the global world financial system, but it also speaks to issues, you know, around gender, and how we look at the development of education for the sexes. And gender equality is achieved when women and men, girls and boys have equal rights, life prospects and opportunities, and the power to shape their own lives and contribute to society. And we could say a lot about gender, but here's a gender development toolbox, and it's the same as the poverty development toolbox. These are the things that affect who you are in that box. And here's a little debunking of the myths, which you can see, about gender and how we perceive it, which is important when you're teaching. But one of the issues in Chapter 8, which I want to look at here, is teacher training, mentorship programs, and curriculum. These three aspects can go towards a socially just school, and you can look at them on the screen. So we're also looking at cultural difference and identity, and they mean a lot when you're a refugee going into education, when you're an asylum seeker, or when you're an Indigenous person looking for a school where you can feel that you identify and you belong, and that your culture is given kudos and given, the prestige it deserves. So Chapter 6 is about refugees, settlers, immigrants, First Nations peoples. And we go back to this circle of opportunity in social justice schools: acceptance, assimilation, identity, reimagined. And it's the connectiveness to education. And there you can see what it means to have that social cohesiveness, equality, social transformation, just and democratic society, vehicle for social mobility. But in the Australian system, we have ICSEA. It's a scale which allows for fair and reasonable comparison amongst the things. And I've just given here, these arrows are pointing towards parents' occupation, parents' education, your culture, proportion of Indigenous students, and your geographic location. All of this is the scale. Now, the scale, which really is no surprise, we can see here, country town public primary school, nearly 100% Indigenous enrolments. The scale has been, there's 76 students, and the students in the top ISIS is 0. Down here in School J, we can see city high fee private primary school, around 400 students, and the scale is 93%. So this is if we can socially reimagine a level playing field using ISA, we can look at a reimagining of school. But to do that, you actually are battling your own social class. Here we have the education department, and I put some arrows here because I just want to look at those 3 chairs. And down here we've also got the Director of Aboriginal Education, Teacher and Learning, and the Director of Student Support Services. And I'm just asking the question, who are these people? Where did they come from? What is their education? Were they part of an elite school, or were they part of a not so elite school out in a remote community? How did they get those positions, and what influences are they making? And further down, we also see teachers have a lot of professional standards, but some professional standards are actually part of the principal's roles, and the principal of a school has a lot of power to bring about change and social reimagining. And you can see here, focusing on what it means to have a professional practice lens, and you can look at that. You know, the Australian Professional Standards for Principals and Leadership Profiles, here we have them here, and you can look at it, and you can see also model of behaviour change, awareness, attitude, knowledge, action, behaviour change. And there we have it here, with the call out, geographical, parents' education, parents' occupation, Indigenous, refuge, asylum seeker, settler, gender. All of those come into play for the Australian way. Are we looking at equality or equity? And we need to call out and make accountable the Department of Education for a fairer social imagining, for social justice schools. Thank you, and here are my references.